This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Matt, Connell, here we are, studio again, cold morning, but we've got nice warm coffees as always, compliments of our coffee chef, Connell McClure. Thank you, Connell, appreciate that.
It's all right, my pleasure to serve you.
Matt, how are you going this morning?
I'm well.
I know you're excited about this episode.
I am. I've been excited about this episode for a while.
Yeah.
And I've been pushing for this, and you guys have finally, I've managed to drag you into it.
Well, I better bring our listeners into the loop then.
Yeah.
Today, listeners, we're going to explore an interesting topic. We're going to look at near-death experiences, or what's commonly called NDEs. So if you hear us refer to that term, NDEs, throughout this podcast, that's obviously what we're referring to, near-death experiences. And you may have heard of people who have had these. You may think that perhaps they're not real. You may think they are. You may have interest. You may not have interest. But we think it's important to actually talk about this because the statistics now tell us that 1 in 25 people in the world have actually experienced a near-death experience, which is a significant number of people now. So this is a growing event for many people. A near-death experience is where someone actually essentially is clinically dead, leaves their body, gets to a certain point, experiences some things that we will talk about in this episode, but then comes back as revived and comes back to life. And the interesting thing is that thousands of these survivors tell very similar stories. There's a lot of alignment between their experience.
Yeah.
There's some dissimilarities in terms of their interpretation, obviously, and we can explore a little bit about that, but there's so much that's in common. And I think we're going to hear today through this conversation how, this is now given to be fact. It's not.
That's right. Yeah,
it's not fiction. It's not people's imaginations. It's actually something that is actually happening here. So let's jump in.
So just to bookend this with a couple of books, I think, important books on this, because there's so much material out there on this, and you just got to be, one of the things that we want to do today is just give you a little bit of a filter or guide to this, because I don't know if it's particularly productive just to go online, for example, and to do endless YouTube videos of anecdotes. I think this is an area that you need to go into discerningly. My general comment is, for me, and I've read, and this is partly why I've been pushing for this, I've read quite a number of books, like accounts, some of the most famous accounts of near-death experiences, published accounts. There's lots of material out there. I have found it overall amazingly confirming of biblical truth on the whole, And
I guess it'd be good to say before you mention the books that the book that we believe, all of us, has all authority in this is, of course, Scripture.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot here that is profoundly confirming of actually what the Bible says. And I think that's not even people that have these experiences and still don't really accept biblical truth. It's interesting because often the fundamentals of what they then start talking about, they don't realize actually how Christian those ideas are. And partly it's because of the culture that we live in. Some of those ideas, like the ideas of love, for example, as being absolutely fundamental. These ideas weren't around until Jesus came and did what he did and taught what he taught. So, overall, I found this fundamentally confirming. Now, as I said, the two books for me that really sort of bookended that, and I had heard of these, and like everyone, you've probably heard of this and that account. Maybe you've read a book, maybe you've seen a YouTube thing or listened to a testimony. I think all of us probably have. I certainly had. And I think I just not swept it aside. I certainly, found them interesting and, but I hadn't given it a lot of thought. Now look, I'm a bit of a skeptic, sort of naturally, and I'm amazed that I'm even a Christian. I'm such a skeptic, but by the grace of God, here I am. And there was a book that came out recently, actually, and I saw it just came up on my Kindle, because I read on Kindle, and it was published by Penguin Books, which, a mainstream publication for me. It was called After by Bruce Grayson, and its book's come out in the last few years. And I thought, oh, gee, that's interesting, a book on near-death, because I just thought it was kooky like a sort of kooky side kind of thing, and has a book by a mainstream publisher by a leading academic who's seriously studying these. Anyway, so as I was reading this book, I mean, he cites an earlier book back in, I think it's the early 70s, around 1973. There was what is now a very famous book, what became a very famous book by Raymond Moody, I've got it here, called Life After Life. And that was really the first sort of scholarly study of this phenomena, really. And in fact, when Raymond Moody sort of launched into this, I mean, he's a leading psychiatrist and doctor, and it was really, I mean, it was almost like career suicide. He says that at this back in that, in those days. And Bruce Grayson points out, when Raymond Moody wrote that book, I mean, it was almost career suicide. And actually, Bruce Grayson read that book back in those days, and actually he had an experience of it with a patient that led him to look into this. And anyway, he founded this research institute, and for 40 years, Bruce Grayson has been, studying these experiences. It's interesting that Raymond Moody says in his book, he says he's drawing on a field of sort of 150 experiences that he knew of, right? And so his book is based on that sort of 150 or so, experiences. Whereas 40 years later, Bruce Grayson is saying there are millions and millions of experiences now, like millions of them. And actually, I mean, Raymond Moody's book, I guess, was the beginning of people taking this sort of stuff seriously. And then, of course, in between, you've got, lots of famous accounts, of this. Yeah. And this is where I think a lot of our listeners would have heard, a number of these accounts. I think, first of all, I mean, Bruce Grayson says, look, the evidence is in so abundantly. This is the first basic thing, right? We are not just our body. He says there is hard, fast proof for the fact that we exist apart from our body, that we fundamentally exist in a spiritual form. And I'm trying not to be too analytical and be fairly general about this, but that is, in a sense, overall his sense that that when the body dies, that's not the end of it. That's sort of the general. Yeah. That's his general. What he thinks we can say hard, fast, almost as a matter of scientific proof.
But it's not quite scientific proof. I mean, there's still a lot of dispute out there, but these are people that are coming from being the ones that would have scoffed at any suggestion that consciousness exists apart from the brain. That's a lot of their background, as they were very hard against that. And then as they've come across more and more evidence and they've looked at it themselves and done a rigorous scientific kind of study to it and collected the data and analysed it, and now they're convinced that these are real experiences. Now, they talk as if they're fighting against the kind of the rational, materialistic view of science that
and there is fight back.
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of pushback from it, but they're kind of like going, we were one of you. We thought there couldn't possibly be anything. These are people who are neuroscientists and
psychiatrists.
So these are the people that you would refer to as being the experts in the brain. They're saying, no, we got it wrong for sure. We've got it wrong. And unless you look at the data and look at the evidence, and I guess that's the difference. A lot of people aren't prepared to look at the evidence and the data and just dismiss it because you've got your own bias. I mean, the bias in science is that there isn't anything beyond the material, so therefore we've got to keep finding materialistic.
So there's a prior commitment there.
There's a prior commitment. See, they can't change the direction of that ship. Yeah. It's probably changing very slowly. But the people that are sort of talking about the evidence that's out there for it, they are coming from that background. It's not like we're coming at this from people who are Christian researchers.
No, that's right.
Many of them are not Christian researchers. Yeah. And they're not pushing any kind of particular ideology. But they're saying,
that's right.
For sure, there is something very significant going on here that challenges that materialistic view.
That's right. And I mean, Grayson's part of this kind of research group, and there's other more academic sort of work that he's been part of that sort of answers a lot of those objections, because a lot of it's, is it just the chemistry? Is it the brain's sort of, I mean, there's all sorts of explanation, and they go through and they just point out why, for example, this doesn't work. I mean, and I think one of the things that sort of tipped him was the fact that a person who was in a coma, unconscious, actually managed to describe something that happened to him in another room of the hospital that could not have possibly, like literally watching him do that.
There's lots of that.
And I was just going to say, there outside of the experts, there's lots of surgeons and medical professionals who have had people recount what happened to them on the operating table, and they're going, how did you even know that?
I reckon it'd be worthwhile just to quickly step through some of those sort of key things. But actually, before we just get there, I kind of still think it's important to make the point of why should we care? Because I have watched lots of videos and read lots bits and pieces of stuff to do with near-death experiences. My reaction's always been, I don't really know. I don't know whether it's real. Are they telling lies? Are they just being deceived? The view in science is it's just a process in the brain of a dying brain and hallucinations. And then the people, when they do recount what happened to them, it kind of sits sort of with Christianity, but then it also conflicts it, and then they conflicts against it. And also other near-death experiences kind of also can be a little bit, there's a lot of overlap, but there's quite a lot of, so it's like my attitude is I just sort of throw my hands up in the air and go, I don't really know what to make of it. And therefore I'm just haven't really been interested in it. And so is there something of benefit for us as Christians to even bother looking into this? Or do we just go, look, who knows, shrug your shoulders and move on? Why should we care to start with, even bothering to spend time on this?
Can I go first and then Matt? Because I think one of the things is that obviously increasingly now, as you said earlier, Matt, millions of people are having this experience. This is going to be becoming a topic that's going to be talked about, and we do need to have an understanding of what that means for us, I think, or we're going to find ourselves floundering, Matt.
Yeah. Firstly, and I think for that reason, Stu, it does matter. I think these things confirm, and my response to the sort of best, kind of summaries, and particularly, based on, material like, Moody and then, Grayson, and because it's problematic when you just lean on one given account. This is the problem with flicking through YouTube clips and just having one person's account. And I'll say a bit more about that because there's a very strong interpretive element as well.
We'll come to that.
That saying there are no facts, only interpretations is somewhat true.
Yeah.
We are always, and even in a post-mortem sort of, even in near-death experience, there is still interpretation. That from the accounts, and I've read many, many accounts, they themselves admit, like they're still interpreting. They're asking and I assumed it was this, because they're very quick to say that it was beyond anything that they could articulate. It was beyond language. And yet they subsequently apply language and frameworks, explanatory frameworks to it, right? So you just got to take that into mind. The application of explanatory frameworks to the phenomena is something that happens at the time and is actually happening after as well.
And I think also that to a degree, perhaps, some of the personal context going into that informs coming out of that.
That's right.
So if you have some kind of religious faith, whatever that might be going into it, it's potentially that you're going to interpret that around, to some degree around that faith as well.
And I think that explains why there's that potential inconsistency, which I think we can talk about as well, how we reconcile this with our Christian faith. But still coming back to why do I care as a Christian? Because I look at it and go, well, I could dismiss it and go, look, seems like there's a level of deception. People are coming back deceived, and they're not coming back necessarily as Christians, and almost some of them are coming back and say like going into the New Age and so on. So you kind of look at it and go, there's a level of deception here. I could just say it's all demonic, have nothing to do with it. But that's kind of a little bit too easy. I mean, people said that about Jesus, and miracles and things that he did. So I don't think we should just dismiss things because we don't understand them. But I do think we also need to understand it because we're going to journey with people who are asking questions about it. And I think we also need to be able to provide perspective on that. And that's why I think this episode's important, because there is a Christian perspective that we need to be clear on. Like, is there something that we can learn from and inform our Christian faith? But then how do we do that safely? Like, what tools do we have to navigate these things? Because there are lots of complexities that kind of spawns out from it. And so I think we just need those. That's why we need to look at it. Yeah. There is danger here. I know in myself, looking at it, I've sort of flip-flopped between being really encouraged and amazed through to being really confused and concerned. You know, like, how do I reconcile all these different things in my head? That's why
that's a good reason to talk about it.
I think that's a good reason why we need to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I could understand how that happens, particularly if you're leaning on individual anecdotes and you're investing a lot into, individual.
Well, I've listened to quite a lot. I'm in awe of the consistency and confused and concerned about the inconsistencies. And then when I listen to other Christian podcasts and so on, that actually dealing with this topic, some of them are saying this is really interesting stuff, and they talk about it from a Christian perspective. And then another one will say, have nothing to do with it. Like, so many of these people are coming out and rejecting
Good. Well, this is why we need to talk about
and going into the new age. And I'm kind of like, and these are people that I would respect as well. So it's like, it's kind of going, well, there is a concern here. And
yeah. And certainly, there's caution here. And part of it, the inconsistencies to me made perfect sense, right? Because I would go in expecting there to be inconsistencies. Yeah. And it's because of the strong interpretive element that, again, is admitted in the accounts. Now, I've surveyed a whole lot of accounts, mainly through reading, books, which includes collections, of experiences as well. Now, you need a whole lot of discernment coming to this. Mm-hmm. This is the thing.
Yes.
You need a whole lot of discernment, right? So so my discernment machine in my head is maxed, right? Is at 10 when I'm reading this. But with that switched on, to me, I've actually, I do this with a lot of things though, because I'm constantly reading philosophy and cherry picking, because there's mixture. It's the human condition. We're experts at deceiving ourselves.
We want it to say what we want it to say.
Yeah. But deception is based on a base level of truth, right? So, because some people think, oh, now I know the truth, that's it, I'm there. Mm-hmm. No, you never, that's not even you're not even close. Just see, knowing, and again, Paul in Romans chapter 1, although they knew God, they neither worshipped him as God nor gave thanks to him, right? So he just assumes, knowing the truth, knowing that there is a God and there's the divine being, and people have that particularly in the context of our culture that's very materialistic, and they make that step, which is where most ancient people would even begin, or certainly in most sort of non-Western materialistic closed worldview cultures, they would just say, that would be a basic starting point. But people in our culture, these experiences get them to there and they think, I have arrived, right? Like, it's like, no, we've not. Like, there's still a whole lot of revelation that's needed, here, or there's a whole lot of thought to go into, okay, well, how are you going to actually respond to this? So and I do think near-death experiences do expose people to some basic fundamental truths, and those, basic fundamental truths include the fact that there's a spiritual aspect to our being that exists after death.
Yep.
Now, for a lot of people, man, that's a big revelation. Everyone always, everywhere is always, but this is what I mean. And yet they treat it like, oh, now I'm some kind of prophet. Like, I now know the truth, I'm enlightened, or that, I encountered God and, whatever it is. Now, a lot of those fundamentals are just really the starting point. That doesn't necessarily get them there. That doesn't mean that, they experience, the love of God but it's not necessarily a silver bullet, because then when they come back, they're still dealing with all the dysfunctionality of their nature, and they still, life still goes haywire. And I mean, they're a step ahead in terms of being more open to, to spiritual things, but that can go wrong too, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That can go the wrong way as much as it can go the right way.
Yeah.
So probably, and I think it's important to sound a note of caution and talk about how to navigate this field, right?
Yeah.
I actually don't recommend just hopping on YouTube. I mean, I don't recommend that for any topic, actually, just hopping on and following YouTube algorithms. Honestly, that's the worst way to research. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Okay. As a way of let me recommend, and I wouldn't necessarily even recommend Moody's or Grayson's. I mean, look, and they're admitting too, like, we're interpreting some things. I mean, I found some things that there are interpretive things that they're doing as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and it's not always declared, actually. When I read their books, I thought, oh, hang on a minute. You're making an assumption there. And that's where there's a whole lot of critical thinking that's needed to just unearth some of the assumptions. Now, I'm trained to find those assumptions. Like, this is what you do in philosophy, right? You unearth assumptions behind statements. Now, you're making an assumption there about that, and about that, right? Now, I found lots of that, even in there trying to be very objective and not do that, right?
Well,
So
everyone's got their bias.
Yeah, that's right. Look, a book actually that I would, if you do want to get into the book, that I would recommend is John Burke's book.
Yeah.
I think was a good place to start. Now, there may be others that I'm, because I don't know. I've tried to get across most of what's there. In fact, I've tried to actually even read most of.
So John Burke is his book's Imagine Heaven.
Yeah.
And he was not a Christian at the time that he had this experience, and he's now the pastor of a church. So John Burke, Imagine Heaven. We'll put this in the notes at the end of the podcast. But yeah.
Yep. So I think that's a useful. I think he discusses these experiences in a useful way. I think he brings a pretty good theological grid to bear. Again, he's making interpretive decisions as well. So
he's looking through the Christian
that's
worldview.
Right. Yeah,
but he's clear about that. He declared that.
But I was, I thought, because I was looking for something that I felt, could be useful for people. And there were accounts also that I thought were, interesting. I mean, one interesting account is the Heaven is for Real, which is about the boy who, I think a 4-year-old boy that has this experience. And I mean, that's interesting because because when it's a child, you're not really, there's not a lot of interpretive grid there. You know what I mean? So that was an interesting one because it is quite objective. So, and the father is a pastor and they're discovering. So that's quite an interesting.
Lynn Vincent was the author of that one.
Yeah, and what's the boy's name?
They made a movie about it. I'm just trying to find his name now.
They did make a movie about it. I should have. I've got a hopeless memory.
Yeah.
I read the book, but I just have completely forgotten.
Colton Burpo.
Yeah, that's right.
4-year-old boy.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people I know have read that book. So a lot of our listeners may have actually already read that book or seen the film. So that is an interesting one. I thought that was, that was a good one to read.
But I do think John Burke's a good start. If you're going to read one thing, just read that.
Yeah.
And I also like to go beyond John Burke and like into Bruce Grayson and some other researchers on it that are not coming at it from a Christian perspective, because I like to look at it, like I don't want to look at it. I like to go to that next level and go, well, that's what it looks like to someone who's trying to make a case, a Christian worldview case. But I'm particularly interested in what those who are not offering that, what to get a bit of balance there, and then try to figure out how to reconcile.
That's right. And look, that's what helped me. Like, I often find, I just always think it's powerful when you've got that, it's like, Rodney Stark, secular historian, sociologist, writing about Christian history from the outside saying, man, this is amazing. Or Tom Holland, admitting the impact of the Christian worldview on our society, and, from that outside point of view, because it's like, if a Christian says that, it's like, but you would say that.
I want to listen to those who don't have a horse in the race.
Now, I don't necessarily recommend that. That as a researcher, that is, I mean,
that's your bread and butter, really.
That's sort of my bread and butter. So for me, the book After by Bruce Grayson, I think was the thing, because he was coming at it from a skeptical point of view and pretty much trying to be as scientific about this as, as he can. And, I thought, wow. And then to read that book and to find so much in that, like look, someone has an experience and then goes off and does all the new agey stuff. Look, what he's doing though, he's drawing on a whole lot of different experiences. And I actually found, on the whole, I found in that book so much confirmation.
Okay. Yeah. But just before you go there, what is the research saying? How do we know that it's not just
imagination?
Because if you talk to a lot of
lot
of doctors now who aren't across the research, they'll say, look, NDEs has just been shown to be the effects of a dying brain, the oxygen deprivation.
It hasn't been shown.
Well, it hasn't, but
these guys would say
the assumption.
That's been discounted.
But I think we've moved beyond there from just having a bit of a theory or an idea to actually having quite substantial evidence that it's not that. Do you want to take us through
that actually is the big part of what the book After is essentially doing. I mean, he's saying, look, we've considered all of these options. We can now rule these out. None of the explanations work.
Yeah. So it's actually quite verifiable. We do have verifiable data that would suggest that these things are real.
Yeah, that's right.
And over large numbers of people now.
Yeah. One of the biggest ones, of course, is the ability. It's what happens almost in the immediate after. It's very hard to verify the ones, like going to heaven and these. Yeah. It's the immediate moment when the soul separates from the body. And it's not only people describing what's happening in the room while the body is flatlined. Yeah. Okay. Who's wearing what? I mean, there's amazing accounts of what the doctors are doing, conversations.
Even what was on top of, located in the room on top of cupboards or something, where you could only know that if you were up. Above. If you're up on a ladder or something up at the ceiling.
And people may say, oh, yes, but maybe there's still something in the brain registering what's in sort of 3D, interpreting what's happening in the room or something. Yeah, but then there are also, again, thousands of accounts of people that are experiencing things that are happening in other rooms. So what their relatives are doing in the other room, down in the foyer, or what a doctor is doing in another space. That happens all the time.
This is what started Bruce Grayson on it, because he talks about the story. He had a spot of sauce on his tie. He'd spilt some sauce on his tie,
and he was trying to get it off. Yeah,
and the person that he was talking to in ICU, who's basically dying. Yeah, they were talking to their friend in another room down the hall, and he'd hidden his tie with the sauce on it. Yeah, because it didn't look very professional. And he'd hidden it, and that he was talking to this friend down the hall. And in a completely separate room, and he noticed that his tie had come out of his shirt, and he got it again and tucked it back in again. Yeah. And then this person who was going to die actually came back to life.
Well, they were unconscious in a completely other part of the hospital.
Yeah, they were off. Yeah. Well, they came back to life, and they mentioned about the conversation. They actually heard the conversation in another room down the hallway, and mentioned the fact
stain on his tie.
So that the only way they could have known that is if that moment that his tie kind of came out from his shirt. So
that was the thing that launched him into.
He launched it and goes, "What? That is? Yeah. There's obviously that."
And he was definitely a skeptic and not a Christian.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And actually he's not writing from a Christian point of view at all, really. Yeah. And it's the same with Moody. So again, this doesn't necessarily lead people to believe, but that's a biblical, just again, knowing the truth, although they knew God, right? Because God has made it plain to them from the things that have seen, his being and his nature have been clearly seen from what has been made, Paul says, but there are still decisions to make there. And, just because people don't make these decisions doesn't really mean much, and because that's what that's being human. We have that. Ability to make decision, interpret in those ways.
Even the account of judgment, I don't know you. That whole sense of you've called on me and you've done all the right things, but I actually don't know you.
So in summary, really, the most hard, fast evidence comes in that immediate stage.
And there's lots of those. This is where, Bruce Grayson then said, I need to research this. And then when he looked into it, started talking to people. Yeah. How many people did he talk to? Was
Yeah,
it was a much larger
1,500 or something.
Something quite significant. And he found this was a very common experience that people became much more aware of, were seeing things that were happening to them or to their body or to other things that were going on in the hospital. I think it was Bruce Grayson also told one story where someone who worked there was a doctor and he was friends with a nurse in the hospital, and the doctor was going off on leave on his holidays, wherever he went to. He was travelled to another part of the world. He actually died. He actually got passed through to this afterlife, and then he saw this nurse who was a friend of his also there, who was alive, and she'd actually given him a message. He was going, "What are you doing here?" You know. She goes, "Oh, I had a car accident, and can you tell my parents they've just bought her a brand new red car and she'd crashed it and killed herself, and can you kind of go back and thank them for buying me, and I'm okay." So anyway, then he came back to life, and then he came back to the hospital and is going, "Oh, I saw this nurse there." And they're going, "Oh, she was killed in a car accident," and had this message about it. And he found out her parents had bought her this car and she was killed in this car accident. Now that's the next level. They've actually gone from awareness of this world and actually seeing them in the...
So in that case, he knew something that he could not have known, that this person had died, and that even had died in the car, in that certain way. So it's stuff like that is taken. There is absolutely no possible explanation other than that they really experienced that they met this other person there. I mean, the one in Heaven is for Real. With the kid is the meeting of the grandfather. Was able to identify the grandfather from a photo, which there's no way the kid could have done unless he had actually met the grandfather. So
they've met siblings who died before they were born.
Yeah,
their parents had never told them that they'd had a brother or sister who'd actually.
So these are the sorts of things, and they're so varied. They're all of these things, where there are things that people cannot possibly know, like the meeting of dead relatives they didn't know, or being able to recognize those relatives, or to know someone that had died that they could not have known that person had died, and so that's the next step away. So there's the experiencing things in the room, seeing things in the room, and then the step after that is the meeting of relatives or people that they didn't know existed.
Yes.
That they could not have known. And that's the next level.
And there's
of evidence.
Lots of those stories. They're not just sort of like, grasping at one or two kind of, there's lots of consistency in that. And the other thing that sort of impacted me with it as well is that these are neuroscientists, and they're saying, look, the explanation that it's actually the results of hallucination from a dying brain doesn't hold water, because the brain itself is flatline. Like there's no discernible brainwave activity, and yet the person feels more alive than they've ever felt. They're having these experiences, they're still accessing their memories, and they're forming new memories. So when they come back to life,
they remember it.
So it's like, but there's no brainwave. It's just, unless there's something else that we're not able to measure, but from all scientific analysis of it, these people are clinically dead. And they should not be forming memories and having these experiences. And what happens is when the brain is deprived of oxygen, you become less aware, less alive, less active, less goes on.
Whereas what happens is that they describe what they refer to as, they describe it as hyper-real. In other words, they experience things with a greater lucidity. And that's an interesting feature of this, because this is not a dreamy thing.
No.
That these experiences aren't dreamy experiences. They've described again and again, it's very consistent, described them again and again as being hyper-real. In other words, they seem to be able to see things, but in a greater clarity and almost in a more multi-dimensional sense. What happens then is when they come back here, this seems dreamy.
Yes.
This seems like a dreamy existence compared with
more
what they experience on the other side of death.
And some people have said, well, maybe it's like a dream. You wake up from dreams and it's like incredibly real. And someone made a point that actually dreams end abruptly. You can be in the middle of a dream and suddenly you wake up. There was no beginning, middle, or end. Where these near-death experiences, they have a starting point, there's a middle, there's something that happens, and then there's now you're going back to your body, and then you wake up. So it actually has all neatly packaged as a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's completely uncharacteristic of,
that's right.
of a dream, which is...
And just before we move on from this, the evidence of this, which we talked about, I think regardless of the individual stories that come from that, the consistencies in the way it's experienced, there's a lot of consistency.
There are. And that's probably, if we move on to that, Noel, because Raymond Moody constructs and again, this is from his sort of 150 accounts. And I think this is probably still true. From reading Grayson's book, 40 years later, this is still true. This is a composite account of what typically happens. So he begins, a man is dying, and as he reaches, or a woman, but anyway, I'm just reading straight from Moody's book, which is Life After Life. A man is dying. As he reaches the point of greatest physical distress, he hears himself pronounced dead by his doctor. That's often quite a common thing. He begins to hear an uncomfortable noise, a loud ringing or buzzing, and at the same time feels himself moving very rapidly through a long, dark tunnel. After this, he suddenly finds himself outside of his own physical body, but still in the immediate physical environment, and he sees his own body from a distance, as though he is a spectator. He watches the resuscitation attempt from this unusual vantage point and is in a state of emotional upheaval. This is a composite sort of thing. Not all of those elements happen to everyone, but he's constructing this out of a number of different commonalities. After a while, he collects himself and becomes more accustomed to his odd condition. He notices that he still has a body in inverted commas, but one of a very different nature, and with very different powers from the physical body he has left behind. So, in the various experiences, they talk about, being able to move, but just through pure intention and being able to almost appear in, not unlike what Jesus did
yes,
in his resurrection body. Yeah. Although this is different than the resurrection body. Jesus' resurrection body was, I think, something again in that it had a physicality, it was a re-embodiment, really, essentially. And yet it had some of these sort of elements. Soon other things begin to happen. Others come to meet and help him. He glimpses the spirits of relatives and friends who have already died, and a loving, warm spirit of light appears before him. This is a very interesting, the being of light. Moody recognizes, and even in other accounts, there is invariably this being of light. And in most cases, people are left to interpret that for themselves. Like, who is this? In a lot of cases, they don't really know. They just know that he's personal and he's loving.
And that's, you say interpret it, but they all pretty unanimously agree that this is a personal being of some kind of God or divine being.
Yeah.
That offers a love that is completely incomprehensible. Can't even put it into words. It's just, and it doesn't just come from the light. It literally fills reality.
Yeah. This is the interesting thing with what we take to these experiences, because Christians who have these experiences, immediately they recognize this is Christ. There's this immediate, this is Jesus, which, Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and in fact, Paul experiences Christ when in his Damascus Road experiences, this blinding light. That's how he experiences the presence of Christ. And so that would make sense from that point of view. Now, just because people don't interpret it that way, because again, there is something that people bring to these experiences, not just things that they take away from these experiences.
And whilst some people experience Jesus, others don't, but the underlying, you are encountering God, this divine being of incredible love that can't even be put into words. Some people in their NDE said, "Who are you?" And Jesus kind of stepped forward, and then other times They don't see Jesus at all. So
it might just be a relative. Interesting. In one book that I read by a Hindu guy who has this experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was confused because he is accompanied by angels like Gabriel and Michael, like biblical angels. And he's confused because he said, hang on, I'm a Hindu. Why are these biblical figures turning up? This is not my religion. So there was an unexpected element for him because he's meeting meeting characters from the Bible. And there are other accounts like this that I read where, again, people meet Jesus who didn't really believe in Jesus, but they're actually meeting Jesus, and that is the element of the unexpected for them.
Well, this is a common criticism against these NDE experiences, because people say, well, it's actually just living out what you already believed, which is what I would have thought. But in my research and reading through it all, that's actually not the case. It's overwhelmingly... obviously there's an interpretation. If you see this being of light, you might say that it's Allah, or it's Brahman, or something. That it only goes as far as that.
So a Jewish person interpreted it as the angel of the Lord.
Yeah,
because again, doesn't really. So again, we can bring limitations. See, again, everything is interpretation. So the difference is whether we have the right interpretive grid or the wrong interpretive grid, or or a inadequate interpretive grid, and so coming to this with without an interpretive grid, there's still the element of I don't really know who this. I thought it was the angel of the Lord, but
you're only putting a name to it. And from what the reading and research that I had done, the argument doesn't really stand up that Muslims in their NDEs see Allah and Muhammad. That doesn't happen. It actually, in fact, I was watching the Muslim apologists trying to explain why Muslims don't see these things and why it always seems to be the God of Christianity or God of love that's not really like who Allah is.
And that actually is at this point, the being of light is associated with love is probably the most common feature is the love element. That would be, in fact, the dominant thing. It's this incredible experience of love as the basis of all things, that it's a being that is characterized by love.
Which is unique to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And yet that's what practically all of these NDEs experience. It's the heart of it all, the impact of that. It's not just, I felt loved, or there's some sort of vague understanding of love. Mm-hmm. These people experiencing are completely
enveloped by it, right?
Completely enveloped and blown away because it's just totally indescribable. Like it's just the way they say it themselves. I can't put it into words, and they're not saying it from a Christian perspective. They're just relaying that thing that's the biggest impact. And so that's the bit you kind of take from that and go, well, that is unique to Christian. Whether Jesus appeared and whether all these other aspects of Christian doctrine were brought forward in that experience, fundamentally, they are encountering something that at the core of it reflects how God has revealed himself.
And not only someone, only in some experiences, people are saying even the surroundings emanate this love, this whole kind of, it's like all of creation in a sense is kind of.
Well, it's interesting. And this is where the interpretive thing, because I found the Hindu guy really interesting because he's interpreting things. So he talks about the being of light, and then he talks about, the universe embraced him with love. But see, with the idea of Brahman, the universe is Brahman. And so he's just putting his words to it, right? So you could read this is where you could read something like this and then go into all the New Age sort of stuff. But he's just putting his word to essentially what he experiences as the pervasive presence of God, who is characterized by love, and this being of light who is, in a sense, a person in some sense that he can't, he doesn't really know.
But that's in contradiction to who Brahman is in Hinduism.
Well, Brahman is it's a fairly impersonal. It's fairly impersonal. And this is the thing in other religions, you have this idea that we should love God, but that God would love us is actually unique to the Christian faith. And it's unique to the Christian faith because there's this sense of this gap between us and God. And so the idea of God loving us, well, the reason that is exclusively the case in Christianity is because of what Jesus did on the cross, is the expression of, how can God love a sinful people? Well, this is, he made way for forgiveness. And so that is the ultimate expression of love. Because of the absence of the cross in other religions, you don't have the same extent of this unconditional love for humanity. By the way, this doesn't mean that people don't experience condemnation. And this is probably the next thing to move. But I just want to underscore that point about the uniqueness, about the pervasiveness of this experience of love, and to really underscore that actually, in the fullest sense, is what is unique to the Christian faith. God is love,
yes.
John says.
Yeah. Now, there is another part to this, and this is where it kind of gets a little hairy, because that other thing that's common across them all is this idea of a life review. So in most of these experiences that people have, they undergo some kind of life review, and so this is quite interpretive then as to what people take away from that. I was reading one of them where they said that they undergo this life review and they feel the bad things that they did on other people, even the thoughts that they had and so on, and how it impacted them, but how it impacted the other person. And they could simultaneously...
And they feel it. They experience it from the other person's point of view.
And then standing there within this being of love that's just pouring down upon them, the sense of, I guess, shame and weight of what they've done. They were almost condemning themselves of going, what have I done? Under the weight of it, in the light of that love, was just crushing with all the bad things that I have done to other people and things that I've thought and so on. And there were little things that didn't mean anything at the time. But in the light of that love,
the contrast is...
And there's actually, I think it's worth saying too, there's a timelessness about these experiences. So they all describe going, like, in this realm, there just doesn't seem to be time. So they can go through their whole lives. So for example, in one account, the guy describes, revisiting these moments of it's like he relives all of these moments of his life, but in like high definition with far more clarity, like even knowing how many mosquitoes were in the environment at the time. Like he just saw it in multi dimensions, right? And anyway, there was one account where the guy described, he goes back to a moment of road rage where a driver comes and is going at him, and he actually beats this guy up on the road, and there was a guy older than him that comes at him with road rage, and he gets out and he just beats this guy up, right, like really quite badly. Anyway, he went back to this particular experience, and he was experiencing that moment from the other. He said, I felt every single blow more clearly than I would almost in the flesh. Like he said, and he said, I could feel not only that, but I felt the full pain of the humiliation of that happening and the trauma of that happening. It just, he said, I experienced the whole thing from as though I was, he inhabited that, that experience. And there are a number of accounts like that where people experience that from the other person's point of view. This is the life review thing. Now we know, again, there's this idea here of judgment of a form, It sort of takes many, many different forms, but there certainly is that aspect.
And I don't think that's the final judgment. I think it's almost like a taster. Like a lot of people talk about it as this life review, but I think it's almost like it's the impact of standing before God. Is that we all of a sudden become aware of what have we done.
Here's the evidence kind of thing.
And it's just an immediate awareness.
But we're not actually facing the judgment, because in all of these, another common element across many of them is the sense that there's a gate or a threshold beyond which, if you pass this point, you cannot go back. And they make a choice as to whether they want to go through or whether they want to go back. And so there is that sense there of you're not really there. You're in, so you've got a foot in each camp. So there is something beyond. So this is why we've got to be careful too what we read into it, because you're only seeing a small picture. There is something beyond. Yeah. But it's interesting that people are seeing this gate, like there is a place to enter that once you're in there, you can't go back. There's a sense of fun. So it's like you enter into probably more of the fullness of what actually lies beyond. So I think all we're getting in these NDEs is a bit of a taster for it.
Yeah,
so,
and there are some pretty amazing tasters, and in a second episode, are you going to let us do
we'll do a
second
second
episode on
episode.
this? We'll talk, because people do experience heaven. It's certainly a heavenly state, and
As we would explain
it's
it.
pretty amazing. Like, again, one of the consistent things is they say it's absolutely ineffable. I can't even explain it in words. Just the sense of joy and the beauty and the absolutely they experience. Even they experience it in terms of fields and waterfalls, and in very.
Well, they don't want to come back.
Yeah, and that's right, and they don't want to come back. But I think it's also worth saying that there are many accounts also of people experiencing, essentially hell in terms that are very much along the lines of what the Bible portrays, in terms of something like the kind of hellfire sort of situation, or the outer darkness sort of thing. They're pretty disturbing experiences that are accounts. In fact, it's interesting. Bruce Grayson, he says, look, I'm almost certain that there are many, many, many more of these than people will share. One, perhaps because of the shame, but largely actually because of the trauma involved, that it's actually, they shut it. It's almost like they dissociate from it when they come back. And so he believes that there are many, many, and that's why, because you get the impression like, oh, well, people die and everyone just goes to heaven. So you're like, well, actually, no, this is the thing, that there are many accounts of hell as well. And this is where, we just, for those that might think, oh, this whole thing about, heaven and hell, it's all a bit mythological. And in all of these experiences, both of those states of being, and maybe in the next
Let's
episode,
pick that up in the next,
we'll go into those a bit more
in the next episode.
But I think, one of the things, the border, what you mentioned about the border is interesting, because one of the things that happens is that people in this space, right, actually interact with God, interact with Christ. Many become Christians in this space, right? They've cried out for forgiveness, and they've found, there's an account of a girl who commits suicide, and she goes into this terrible, hellish experience. Honestly, the description of it is just absolutely horrible. But she cries out, and God, reaches in essentially and, grabs her out. Now she's having as you say, in this slightly borderish experience, she's having this, perhaps you could call it a foretaste. Again, even we're using language here. Even we're using language. I think it's very difficult to be dogmatic about this. I think all we can do is go back to what the Bible says. There is a heaven and there is a hell, right? It's one or the other, depends on whether we find forgiveness, right? Because we've all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Yeah. But what comes out of some of these experiences is how willing God is actually to save people. Now, then there was one account actually where, and this is in Bruce Grayson's book, where the person is having this hellish experience, but finds that his will is so locked against God, he actually can't even will to cry out to God.
Wow.
Like he's actually locked in a state of unwilling. That's so trust in Jesus now, right?
Yeah,
it's like trust in Christ now. this is all what the Bible's talking about, right? So, even those that have these experiences of love and, so they have this knowledge of a God of love, and then they come back to life. Well, what are you going to do with that, right? Because the more you know, the more responsible you are.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't guarantee anything for the next time that you go to death. So again, the message here is forgiveness becomes all important, right? Because we are all deserving of condemnation. But this underscored the importance of actually what Jesus did so that we could find forgiveness, so that we could find reconciliation with God, forgiveness for our sins, so that we would not be finally condemned. And I think in all of these, we need to come back to this. At the end of the day, we have to come back to Scripture as the basis. It's through what the Bible says that you are going to find salvation, right? Just knowing some stuff or interpreting experiences in certain ways, and certainly just reading other people's experiences, that's not how you're going to find salvation. If you want to find salvation, you need to read Scripture's guide to finding salvation through Christ and take that seriously, and make sure that the most important decision that you make in this life is that you say yes to Jesus.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.